Week 2 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. Last week had a problem outside the stadium in handcuffs. Then a couple hours later, he goes on the field, puts on a big performance. And this week, Thursday Night Football versus the Buffalo Bills, a team had success against, is Tyreek Hill. I think he goes out there once again and has a big performance. Number 2, Cooper Kupp, the Los Angeles Rams with Puka Nacua out. Cooper Kupp's going to be a target machine once again. He's healthy. 14 receptions in week 1 after Puka went out near halftime. And this week in a good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals, a team he's obviously familiar with within the division. I think Kupp goes out there, has another big ball game. Number 3, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. I think Lamb's got to get his legs under him a little bit more, but he looked decent in the few balls he caught in the week 1 victory versus the Browns. And the Cowboys, they didn't have to push the envelope and getting the football down the field. They played pretty quiet ball game offensively, but they made the plays when they had to. And this week versus the Saints, who came off a nice victory, I think CeeDee Lamb has a better game this week. Number 4, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. A.J. Brown, big ball game with a 67-yard touchdown in Brazil versus the Green Bay Packers. This week, a good matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons, a secondary that I don't really think is going to stop Brown at all in this one. And him and Jalen Hurts, over the last few seasons, they've just been on the same page and making big plays. And I think once again, we'll see that. Number 5, Justin Jefferson of Minnesota Vikings. A lot of people were worried that Sam Darnold wasn't capable of getting Jefferson the ball, but week 1 he found the end zone. I know the yards weren't all that great, but they didn't have to put up a lot of points, and they ran the football a whole lot. Was Minnesota. Once they were up double digits in that third quarter versus the Giants. So this week in a matchup versus San Francisco, where I believe they're going to have to throw early and often, and they'll be trailing early. Justin Jefferson has a better game this week. Number 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So St. Brown last week, one of the worst games of his NFL career. Only 4.30 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And St. Brown, I think, is going to bounce back in a big way. This week, a good matchup versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Antonio Winfield is going to be out 2 to 4 weeks, one of their better secondary players. It was just a fluky game all around where the running game definitely, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery with a focal point and had big games. So St. Brown bounces back this week. Number 7, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, a good week 1 performance, going over 100 yards. And this offense is lethal. And this week, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus the Chicago Bears, where their defense definitely played well versus the Tennessee Titans in week 1. But Nico Collins, great route runner. He's a burner out there. Him and C.J. Stroud have great rapport since day 1 last season. And this week, I think Collins puts in a great performance. Once again, number 8, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Ever since Baker Mayfield got there, Mike Evans has taken his game either to the same level it was with Tom Brady that first season, or even better. So last week, 2 touchdowns for Evans. This week, a good matchup at Detroit in a potential shootout. And Mike Evans, he just keeps putting up numbers year in and year out. Number 9, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Jalen Waddle last week, he left the game for a few minutes and then returned, and he had a monster performance, 108 yards receiving. So this week, Thursday Night Football, usually the games are high scoring. Jalen Waddle, he's a dynamic receiver, no doubt about it. I don't know if he's going to get 100 yards once again, but I believe he's a top 10 option. Number 10, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So I'm a little lower on Chase than people are. I know he's a talented wide receiver, top 2, top 3, possibly in the NFL. But last week he wasn't 100%. And missing training camp definitely takes a toll on some of these plays. And we saw with Jamar Chase, and this offense couldn't move the football at all versus the New England Patriots. So this week versus even a better defense and an AFC foe at the Kansas City Chiefs, it might be tough sledding once again. But Jamar Chase, it just takes one big play and a couple plays for him to have a day. So this week, he's still a top 10 option. Number 11, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. It's looking like Christian McCaffrey's injury is worse than it appears. Now they're saying it's an Achilles possibly, not just a calf injury. I don't think Christian McCaffrey's going to play in this game in Minnesota. So Deebo, we saw in week 1, had 8 carries. We saw him do his thing in the middle of the field to make plays. And this week with a way easier matchup than versus the New York Jets last week. Number 12, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Rashee Rice, if there was definite word earlier in the preseason and going into fantasy drafts, he would have been in that 4th or 5th round range, worst case, at the receiver position. So last week, an easy ball game, over 100 yards. This week, another good matchup versus Cincinnati Bengals. And Rashee Rice, he's working his way up the rankings over the last few weeks. And this week, he's a top 12 option. Number 13, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Garrett Wilson, he looked good in his debut with Aaron Rodgers, even though we know they played in the preseason last season together. Garrett Wilson's a good route runner. He's got speed. He goes out there and makes plays. And this week, it is a tough matchup, believe it or not, at Tennessee. Last week, they shut down DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, but I still believe Garrett Wilson's a great talent and has a good game this week. 14, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. This week, Devonta Smith, I think, has a monster performance. Atlanta's secondary isn't all that great. And last week, Smith, he had the typical Smith game. He'll go out there, make a few big plays, nothing flashy, put points on the board, and he's very underrated number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners. 15, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. Malik Nabers, in his NFL debut, he had over 60 yards in that one. Daniel Jones, he looked like one of the worst quarterbacks in the league, no doubt about it. But Nabers, he's a dynamic wide receiver. He could go out there and make plays. And I think this week at a weak Washington secondary that got torched last week by Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, Malik Nabers goes out there and has a big performance. 16, Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. So last week, Davante Adams, he only had 5 catches, 59 yards on the week. But a lot of receivers definitely struggled in week 1, and it takes a couple weeks sometimes for these guys to get going. This week in a game where they're going to be trailing early and often at Baltimore, I think Adams is going to work his way into volume. Pretty much him and Brock Bowers, the 2 main options in this offense for this Vegas Raider team. And we know Gardner Minshew's a gunslinger, and he'll try to force feed Adams. 17, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. London last week, 2 catches, 15 yards. Obviously a horrible ball game, but I still believe London's going to have a good season. Kirk Cousins, he's rusty, obviously, coming off a torn Achilles and maybe not 100%. And this week at a beatable secondary at the Philadelphia Eagles, where we saw Jaden Reed torch him and Christian Watson find the end zone. I think London bounces back. 18, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Last week, a horrible game. It was 1 catch, 4 yards. Even though towards the end of the game, he was open in the end zone, and it would have been a big play for the Arizona Cardinals. But Kyler Murray just didn't see him. So this week, matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams, their secondary isn't all that great, even though they held down St. Brown in week 1. So I think Marvin bounces back in the home opener, and he's just a great talent. I know he's a rookie. There's a lot of pressure, but he's got all the tools and obviously the gene as well. Number 19, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Chris Godwin working more in the slot in week 1, and it worked out big time. 8 catches, 83 yards, and a touchdown. This week, a matchup at Detroit. I think Godwin, when he's underneath route running and good hands, could go out there and have another good performance. And now 2 seasons off that torn ACL. He's 100% healthy, I believe, is Godwin. And him and Baker Mayfield have built even more of a rapport. Number 20, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Stephon Diggs in his debut was a Houston Texan, found the end zone twice. The only thing, he didn't run a lot of routes in that game. There's a lot of mouths to feed. Diggs, Nico Collins obviously tanked out, but Stephon Diggs is a number 2, 3 option for fantasy owners. Each and every week, he could be solid, and this week in a matchup versus the Bears, where I think this Houston Texan team is going to go up and down the field. I think Diggs once again has a good game. 21, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. And Metcalf, he had a bad game in week 1. And like I said, a lot of top wide receivers underperformed and didn't play well, but this week a decent matchup at the Patriots, where the Seattle Seahawks team, I think, are going to have to get the ball down the field through the air, where they're going to want to take out the running game, either Kenneth Walker or Charbonnet, depending if Walker plays in this one. Anyway, DK Metcalf, he's a solid wide receiver, and I think he has a bounce back. 22, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So Ayuk last week, the rust definitely showed, dropped a couple passes, including a diving grab in the back of the end zone versus the New York Jets, where 9 out of 10 times we've seen him catch it. So training camp definitely takes an effect on players if they don't do training camp. They need the reps. They need the practice, get the rapport down. But this week in Minnesota, I think Ayuk has a bounce-back performance. 23, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. This week, a matchup in a potential shootout at the Houston Texans. And we know this Bear team, they need to put points on the board if they want to compete with a high-flying offense with Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, Joe Mixon, and Stroud at quarterback. And DJ Moore, we know he's a great route runner. Him and Caleb Williams have to get on the same page. And I think Moore has a better game week than last. 24, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, another receiver, only 3.10 fantasy points. And it was just week 1 rust, I think, for most of these players. So we know in the preseason, these top players don't play for the most part. In training camp, they get their reps managed as well. So this week at Dallas, with New Orleans, they know they got to put up a lot of points. Last week they put up 47. Olave didn't contribute, and this week they know he needs to contribute if they want to have a chance to win this game. Number 25, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So Flowers, he was getting peppered with targets in the first half of that matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs. But a lot of bubble screens, a lot of short yardage stuff. But Flowers, in my opinion, is the number 1-2 option in that offense. Mark Andrews, he got phased out a little bit, but Isaiah Likely stepped up with a big game. But I think Zay Flowers in a good matchup versus the Raiders, especially they have trouble versus slot and small receivers. We saw last week with Ladd McConkey. Flowers is a good flex, 3 option, 26, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pickens, he's just an athletic wide receiver. He goes out there and he makes big-time catches and big plays that some receivers can't do. And this week it's going to be a tough matchup, no doubt about it, with Patrick Surtain on him. But Pickens is a flex option. I still believe volume alone will make plays because they have no one in this passing game besides him and Freiermuth as the top 2 options. And Fields, it looks like, is going to start once again. And him and Fields made some decent plays last week. 27, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So this Colt team, obviously things have changed now with Anthony Richardson healthy, where he's going to be a deep ball thrower. Michael Pittman's not much of a deep ball route runner, where they got Alec Pierce, Adonai Mitchell, and Josh Downs, who should be back sooner than later. So Michael Pittman's definitely falling down the rankings from week 1 to week 2. Like I said, Richardson's a run quarterback and a deep ball quarterback, where he's not really that intermediate thrower for the most part is Pittman. He likes to stretch the field as Richardson and run, but this week at Green Bay, I think Pittman could find his way into a decent ball game. 28, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. Williams had his coming out party last week, over 100 yards and a touchdown in that one versus Rams. So this week versus Tampa Bay, their secondary's banged up. Antonio Winfield out 2 to 4 weeks. Potential shootout indoors. And Jared Goff has a lot of trust in Jameson Williams, but just suspensions and injuries cost him pretty much the first 2 years. 29, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. Xavier Worthy, he fits this offense like a glove. 2 touchdowns in his debut, and he didn't even need a lot of touches to get it. He had a jet sweep, found the end zone his first play of his NFL career, and then a deep ball later in the game down the sideline. So Mahomes, likes to stretch the field, and now he's got a deep ball threat once again with Worthy, and it's a decent matchup for Cincinnati. Number 30, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. So Tank Dell, I know the numbers weren't great, but he's still going to run a lot of routes. He's going to be in all the 3 wide receiver sets, and he's a burner and explosive playmaker as well. So this Texan offense, a dynamic offense with a lot of weapons, and they could beat you a lot of ways. So this week versus Chicago, I think Tank Dell goes out there, has a good performance, and him and CJ Stroud going back to last season have a good rapport. 31, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So last week, McLaurin, he had under fantasy points in PPR leagues. This week, a great matchup versus the New York Giants, a team he's had very good success against in his NFL career, obviously playing 2 times a season in the NFC East. But Terry McLaurin, the volume's definitely going to go down with Jaden Daniels being a running quarterback and taking a lot of chances to run the football. So McLaurin's ceiling isn't high, but this week is a number 3 wide receiver flex option versus a weak Giant defense. I think he could go out there and have a decent performance. 32, Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. So believe it or not, Keenan Allen was targeted the most in that Week 1 victory versus the Tennessee Titans. But Keenan Allen, he was limping a little bit towards the end of that game. Either ankle or a hamstring it must have been. And we'll see if he plays in this one. But if he does, he's a low-end option as well with a lot of mouths to feed. And honestly, I don't trust Caleb Williams. I know it was one game, not to overreact. But even in college, we saw in some of those bigger games last season, Caleb Williams, in the big moments, he didn't make some of the plays. And his team lost those ball games. But this week at Houston, he can't be any worse than he was last week. And I think Keenan Allen has a better game. 33, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So this Bengal team desperately needs T. Higgins back in the lineup after he hurt the hamstring in practice last week and didn't play. So this week at Kansas City, a big AFC matchup. I know they've had success, this Cincinnati Bengal team versus the Chiefs over the last few seasons. And if Higgins does play, I think he's a perfect flex option. 34, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So if Jordan Love was in there, obviously Jaden Reed would be in the top 24, 27 range for me this week. But now with Malik Willis at quarterback, everyone's stock goes down in this offense. Willis, he's not much of a thrower, not much of a quarterback that's going to stretch the field from what we've seen from Willis with the Tennessee Titans. And also, who knows if he's up to snuff with this playbook. He's only been with the Packers 3-4 weeks after the Titans traded him in the preseason. So this week with a quarterback who's an unknown, but I doubt he's really going to stretch the field, and Reed puts up a good game. He's low on the list, 35, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So a good debut for the rookie Thomas Jr. finding the end zone. Him and Trevor Lawrence look like they're on the same page already. But this week's a tough matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. I thought the Browns, even though they got blown out by the Cowboys, did a good job on CeeDee Lamb. He didn't have a monster performance. Brandon Cooks, besides that touchdown, he didn't do much in that one. And this week, I think it's going to be a tight contested game between the Browns and the Jacksonville Jaguars, where these wide receivers won't go wild. So Brian Thomas is a flex option and still a young player, obviously, learning the system in the NFL game. Is at the back end of the list, and the 36th and final receiver on rankings, another rookie, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. McConkey had a touchdown. He looks like the number one option over there, and there's not much to beat out. Quentin Johnson so far in his short career has been a bust, and he was a first-round pick last season. And Joshua Palmer is more of a third receiver and a slot guy. McConkey, even out of the slot, I think can make things happen, and he's a quick route runner and a guy who can make plays underneath and has yard after catch bursts. So this week with a good matchup with Carolina, I think he's a good flex option. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 2 of the fantasy football season.